Hello, this is Pastor Micah from Life's Journey, United Church of Christ. We've been going through a midweek reflection series on Jesus' Beatitudes. And we come tonight to near the end of our midweek reflections on Jesus' Beatitudes at least. And by looking at Matthew 5, verses 10 and 12. In the New International Version, this text reads, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." These are tough words. I can't speak for you, but they make me cringe a little bit. Who wants to be persecuted, lied about, spoken evil of? Who wants to face resistance and discrimination? Well, this is something that Jesus is saying that we can't get out of as people of faith. But it's important to notice what he doesn't mean. This past week, I've encountered a few folks who've missed the point of Jesus' words. You might have too. First, this past Saturday, I stood with members of Siembra, a group that supports immigrant, Spanish-speaking, and Latinx neighbors here in our community, as they spoke up for the need to hear their voices and the voices of people of color around legislation in our community that harms the Latinx, Spanish-speaking, and immigrant community, as well as to question continuing to keep Confederate statues, symbols of our state's racist past, first, as a state that held people in slavery, and then as a state that treated non-white people as second-class citizens under the Jim Crow laws that were erected side by side at the same time as our Confederate statues, about whether to keep these symbols of racism, a legacy, a heritage of racism, as centerpieces in our town squares. As I stood with those speaking up for immigrants' rights, for building a community that doesn't feel as antagonistic to minorities and people of color, just as an ally and a support, I encountered people who saw that I was a pastor and began to turn my ear, hoping I would be sympathetic. In various ways, they said to me, "Look, Pastor, they are trying to tear down our Christian way of life, our heritage. They are persecuting us." Well, the folks who came to me saying this, not a one of them could answer when I asked them, how does the legacy that statue represents, this law represents, of slavery, of segregation, and those who fought for both, how does that legacy in any way embody the way of Jesus and of Christianity? How is your faith being persecuted when people ask for people to not have to be afraid of their police any longer? Shouldn't their police be people they aren't afraid to go to, based on the color of their skin or the language they speak? How is that against your Christianity? what Bible are you reading? Similarly, I saw a few folks I know, even a cousin or two of mine, post on social media proudly about how they had refused to wear face masks in public, though they got asked to leave when at stores. And they claimed they're being asked to leave because they refused to care for their neighbor by wearing a face mask was them being persecuted for their faith as Christians. As if what the Christian faith means is we don't have to be inconvenienced with other people's needs. What Jesus praises in the Beatitudes, this final Beatitude, could not be further from the kinds of things these folks were claiming they were being persecuted for when people questioned their commitment to these things they were holding on to, rather than worrying about the impact on their neighbor. Instead, Jesus talks about people being blessed when they are persecuted for righteousness, which is a Bible word meaning working for justice, working for fairness, working for equity for all people. It is about a leveling of the playing field. Jesus talks about when people are persecuted, insulted, lied, or spoken poorly of for Jesus and his way. In other words, for following the footsteps of Jesus. I think Jesus is pointing us toward the fact that walking in the way Jesus revealed can be costly. And his way was a way of righteousness or equity and justice, both in terms of tearing down the barriers that exclude others, and also in terms of leveling the playing field between the powerless and the powerful, the haves and the have-nots. The Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus' words are written, are spoken, is written after the first fledgling churches, which first read Matthew, have already faced persecution for as a community tearing down walls that kept others out to welcome them in, and for being folks that build communities in which power, food, and wealth was redistributed to make opportunity for food, for shelter, for work, for opportunities to shine, to be shared among all people of every class and background who joined the new Christian community. The way they welcomed, served, and shared in those communities that were persecuted, which is what walking the footsteps of Jesus, always looks like, was a way of justice that those committed to injustice in the world around them found threatening and felt they must wipe out. If it spread, it threatened their power. You see, the example of what being persecuted for justice looks like in our recent history, you see it in how Christian leaders like Martin Luther King and the late John Lewis faced persecution. John Lewis was nearly killed when, as a young man, he joined the protests for equal treatment for black people and people of all races under Martin Luther King. He was persecuted for working for justice. When he recovered, to the very day he died, John Lewis called people to engage in what he called good trouble, work to upset the injustice all around them. Martin Luther King, too, was jailed, was threatened, was called a communist and traitor, though he was neither, had assassination attempts aimed at him that failed, and finally died when one final assassination attempt succeeded. These leaders of faith, were persecuted for righteousness, for the way of Jesus. One of my favorite heroes of the faith, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was given a choice. He could be silent at Hitler's rise to power and how it led to persecution of minorities, of gay men and women, of people with disabilities, of gypsies, of minority religions, of Jews, a persecution that led to concentration camps and death. Bonhoeffer knew this beatitude. In fact, he wrote a whole book about this section of Matthew. And he knew he could not be silent, not and be faithful to Christ. And so he organized with others the Confessing Church, a series of churches throughout Germany that chose to risk persecution by the German Nazi regime, a persecution that led to Bonhoeffer's death, all for choosing not to be silent about the injustice being done by the people in power. Martin Niemöller, one of Bonhoeffer's partners in this Christian resistance to Hitler, famously described the choice to be silent. Far too chose this way. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, for I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Niemöller and Bonhoeffer chose to speak up, risking their lives and livelihoods because they knew what Dr. King later said was true when he said, "There comes a time in which silence is betrayal. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Jesus praises a willingness to face persecution for following in his way of compassion and justice, because he knows ultimately too often history turns not on the question of who are overtly evil and unjust. Their actions are only possible because many indifferent people or people who know better look the other way or do nothing. To not speak communicates a message. To not act empowers others to act and often empowers the worst among us. As Desmond Tutu said to those looking away in indifference during the days of apartheid in South Africa, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. The challenge Jesus gives you and me could not be more timely. There is much injustice around us, much mistreatment of minorities, and the least of these. We also are on the brink of climate catastrophe with just a few years to turn around our trajectory from falling into ecological chaos. And it remains easy to be silent, to be as those Niemöller, King, and Tutu challenged for their silence. Yet, the way of Jesus calls us to be silent no more, to speak up, to act, not just in our own self-interest, but for those around us and those who come after us. It means being willing, like these heroes of faith, to risk discomfort and ease for the sake of building a more just and loving world, a more inclusive and welcoming community. May we hear and to answer that call today and all our days. Amen and amen.